If someone can control your life with just a pinch of salt, what else have you already surrendered without noticing? That was the question I kept asking myself the night everything quietly collapsed. Inside a kitchen that wasn't even mine. Under a porch light that flickered like it was trying to warn me. I had married Ethan believing love meant partnership, warmth, and the kind of safety that lets you laugh at your own mistakes. But the truth is, a home changes shape depending on who believes they're running it. And in our case, his mother Marilyn didn't just believe it. She'd built an entire world around being the one who knew best. About everything. Especially me. At first, I tried to blend in. I softened my voice, adjusted my steps, tucked away pieces of myself so I wouldn't be too much. I told myself it was temporary, that kindness would eventually open space for me. But kindness without boundaries turns into something else. Something that erases you so slowly you barely notice you're fading. Until one night in her kitchen, when she reached over my shoulder, again, and salted my dish as if my hands didn't exist. As if I didn't exist. That was the moment the story truly begins. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with a quiet decision that felt like learning to breathe in my own lungs again. This isn't a story about villains. It's about control that went unnoticed, love that bent too far, and the gentle kind of courage it takes to finally say, "This space belongs to me too." And if you've ever felt small in a room you were supposed to belong in, stay with me. If this opening resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more of this story to uncover together. Claire had spent the whole afternoon simmering the chicken broth, tasting it every few minutes the way her mother once taught her, quietly, patiently, like listening for a familiar voice. When Marilyn and Ethan walked through the door, Claire felt her chest open a little, hoping for something warm to settle in. Instead, Marilyn lifted the spoon, frowned slightly, and said with a half smile, "Oh, honey, it's a little bland, isn't it?" Claire kept her own smile steady, her fingers tightening around the wooden spoon, just enough for the edge to dig into her palm. She nodded politely, stepping back so the air wouldn't feel so crowded, the steam curling around her face in a way that felt more honest than her expression. She told herself not to take it personally. This was just dinner. But the sting sat quietly between her ribs, like a secret bruise no one could see. Marilyn moved past her with the ease of someone walking into her own kitchen, turning the stove knob as if it had been waiting for her touch. The flame flared up a notch. Claire stepped back a half inch, then another, barely noticeable, but she felt every millimeter. Marilyn didn't say anything outright, but her hands spoke a whole language. The practiced twist of a lid, the adjusted angle of the pot, the way she reached for the salt without looking. Claire stood there, still holding the spoon, suddenly unsure where to put her hands or her presence. She watched the woman stir the broth, watched her claim the space with simple movements, and something inside her shrank just a little. She tried to breathe normally, but even the kitchen air felt rearranged. Ethan came beside them, trying for a neutral tone as he said, "Mom just wants to help. She's excited." But he didn't meet Claire's eyes when he said it, and that void, small but sharp, landed heavier than whatever Marilyn had changed in the pot. Claire nodded once, though she wasn't sure anyone saw it. She watched Ethan hover between them, his smile a little too quick, too careful, as if he were smoothing wrinkles on a tablecloth he didn't want to admit was torn. She reached for a towel just to give her hands something to do. The broth smelled richer now, more salt, louder herbs, but not like her cooking anymore. The three of them stood there in a triangle of uneven footing. After dinner, Claire slipped out into the hallway, pretending she needed to take the trash, even though the bag was barely half full. She welcomed the excuse to step into the cooler air, to let the faint scent of detergent and old carpets wrap around her, instead of the discomfort still clinging to her skin. Her footsteps were soft against the dark runner rug, the muted overhead lights giving everything a gentle haze. The apartment doors were all closed, the silence so complete it almost hummed. She leaned a shoulder against the wall, letting the quiet settle her heartbeat. She reminded herself that everyone had awkward beginnings. She told herself this wasn't a warning, it was just a moment. Still, her pulse took its time calming down. When she returned, she paused by the small kitchen shelf where she kept her everyday things, spices, tea bags, and a tiny glass bottle she used for homemade sauce. It looked almost decorative tonight, catching the dim light like something harmless and still. The bottle had been with her through different apartments, different chapters, always tucked somewhere easy to reach. She touched the metal cap with one finger, feeling the coolness of it anchor her for a second. It reminded her of herself in a way, simple, consistent, not loud, not competing. A quiet habit she didn't need permission for. She closed the cabinet gently, letting the soft click steady her breath. She walked back toward the living room just as the hallway light spilled through the apartment doorframe. Marilyn appeared there suddenly, opening the door without knocking, the glow catching the edge of the carpet like a thin line being drawn. Claire froze for the smallest moment, her hand still on the counter behind her. Marilyn smiled as if nothing were unusual, stepping inside like she'd always had the right to. The silence stretched, subtle but undeniable. Claire inhaled slowly, tasting the remnants of dinner in the air. Her food, someone else's seasoning. Something shifted quietly inside her, a feeling she couldn't yet name, but it stayed with her as the door swung fully open. Claire tried to match the energy around Marilyn's dining table, though the room carried a formality that made her sit a little straighter than usual. She'd cooked a light dish, delicate seasoning, softer flavors, hoping it would ease the tension from last time. She watched Marilyn take the first spoonful, her eyes following every small movement like she was bracing for impact. The older woman paused, tilted her head, then set the spoon down with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Claire kept her face open, neutral, the way you do when you're unsure whether you're about to be corrected or dismissed. She folded her hands loosely in her lap, pretending she wasn't waiting for judgment. The dining room felt warm, but her neck prickled as if a breeze had slipped through. Marilyn gave a short laugh, too light to be friendly, too sharp to be harmless. "Ethan likes things more flavorful," she said, directing the words toward him instead of Claire. It wasn't an accusation, not exactly, but it landed in the middle of the table all the same. Claire's chest tightened in a quiet, invisible way. She glanced at Ethan, searching for something, reassurance, humor, anything that might anchor her. He cleared his throat, offering a half grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom eats saltier than we do," he said, attempting to smooth the moment without choosing a side. Claire nodded gently, letting the remark pass through her like a gust that ruffles but doesn't uproot. Dinner continued with polite conversation, though Claire found herself drifting, responding automatically while her mind hovered elsewhere. Each clink of silverware sounded strangely amplified. She noticed how Marilyn's eyes tracked the dish every time Claire reached for it, as if she were watching for mistakes, or simply waiting for one. Claire kept her tone calm, steady, asking about work, the garden, the neighbors, anything that filled the space without feeling forced. The food cooled on her plate. Every bite tasted like an attempt. When the meal finally ended, she felt both relieved and strangely empty, as if she'd passed a test she hadn't agreed to take. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, cooler, threaded with evening sounds that grounded her. "I think I'll walk a bit," Claire said softly, needing a moment alone. Ethan nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets, though he stayed behind to help his mother with the dishes. Claire stepped onto the quiet stretch of sidewalk, the night settling around her like a loose shawl. A neighbor strolled past with a stroller, the baby's small hands reaching toward the streetlights. Claire offered a gentle smile, returning their greeting with a warmth that surprised her. That fleeting exchange eased something in her chest, reminding her she wasn't invisible, not everywhere. By the time she and Ethan returned home, Claire's shoulders had loosened, her mind a little steadier. But as they approached the apartment door, she noticed an envelope on the floor, its corner jutting out from the gap as if it had slipped through hastily. The thin paper lay there, pale against the dark hallway carpet. Something about the angle, the slight bend, the crispness, made her pause. Ethan reached for it, but Claire knelt first, her fingertips brushing the edge. The sound it made when she lifted it, small, sharp, unmistakable, echoed strangely in the quiet hall. She didn't know why, but it felt like the beginning of something. The next morning, Claire stood by the kitchen counter sorting through the mail when Ethan walked in, holding a notice from the building office. "Strange," he murmured, scanning the page. "They updated our condo fees again." Before Claire could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Marilyn. "Saw the new fee changes. Hope it's not too much for you two." Claire blinked at the message, her brows drawing together. She looked at Ethan. "Did you tell her already?" He shook his head, still reading the notice. A soft confusion settled between them. Claire folded the message away like a tiny burr under her skin. It wasn't serious, she told herself, just timing. But it lingered anyway, an odd dissonance she couldn't shake. Later, Claire chopped vegetables for dinner, the kitchen quiet except for the rhythmic knock of the knife. She felt someone behind her before she heard anything. When she turned, Marilyn stood almost shoulder to shoulder with her, peering into the pot as though she had been invited. Claire forced a polite smile, willing her shoulders not to stiffen. Marilyn didn't move away. She murmured something about keeping the heat even, leaning close enough that her breath brushed the back of Claire's neck. A chill slipped beneath Claire's collarbone, quick and uninvited. She stepped sideways, creating space that felt too small anyway. The pot simmered harder, as if reacting for her. When Claire lifted the lid, she frowned. The broth smelled sharper, saltier than she remembered leaving it. She dipped a spoon, tasting it, and her tongue burned with an unmistakable intensity. She hadn't added that much. She knew she hadn't. Her eyes drifted toward the counter where Marilyn had stood earlier. She replayed the moment. A slight clatter, the cabinet door, the way Marilyn had angled her body. Claire felt the uncertainty coil tighter. She wanted to ask, but the question felt too fragile to say aloud. Instead, she stirred the pot, watching the liquid whirl, trying to calm herself with the motion. It didn't work. When the walls felt too close, Claire found the cat curled up near the front door, flicking its tail as if summoning her. She grabbed the leash and slipped outside with the animal tucked under her arm. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of laundry vents and damp concrete. The cat nudged her chin, then her hand, persistent and comforting in a way only pets seem to understand. Claire walked slowly down the hallway, her steps echoing softly, the cat's purr steady against her palm. Each exhale she released felt a little heavier than the last, like letting out invisible threads of the day she hadn't realized she was holding. She stopped near the window at the end of the hall, letting the cat settle on her shoulder. "Tell me I'm not imagining things," she whispered, pressing her cheek against its soft fur. The cat blinked lazily, its warm weight grounding her, reassuring without making promises. Claire closed her eyes, letting a single tear slide down. Not dramatic, not breaking her open, just a small release. She wiped it quickly and breathed in the quiet. The hallway hum filled her ears, gentle and distant. She stayed there until her heartbeat steadied. When she finally turned back, the cat trotted beside her like a shadow that knew her better than she admitted. As she neared the elevator, a metallic chime echoed through the hall, one sharp ding that broke the stillness. The elevator doors didn't open. The sound simply rang once, then vanished, leaving a clean cut of silence behind it. Claire paused, her hand hovering in the air. Something about that single note felt pointed, as if the building itself had exhaled at her. She waited a beat longer, then walked on, the cat's tail swaying like a metronome beside her. The unease followed her quietly, like a footstep that didn't belong to either of them. Claire returned from the grocery store earlier than planned, her keys still in her hand as she stepped through the doorway. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, except for the faint clatter of metal from the kitchen. She walked in slowly, each step tightening the air around her. Marilyn stood at the stove, her posture relaxed, almost casual, sprinkling a clean, deliberate stream of salt into the pot Claire had left simmering. Her movements were unhurried, like someone adding a finishing touch to their own dish. Claire froze in the doorway, absorbing the scene with a cold clarity she hadn't expected. The kitchen felt smaller, her voice caught somewhere beneath her sternum. Marilyn turned slightly, not startled at all. "Just helping you fix the seasoning," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her tone held no apology, no hesitation, only a subtle assurance that she knew better. Claire gripped the grocery bag tighter, its plastic handles biting into her fingers. "Did I ask for help?" she asked quietly, though her pulse thudded hard enough to make the room feel off balance. Marilyn's expression didn't change. "You were close, but it needed a little more." At the doorway, Ethan appeared with his jacket still half on, stopping mid-step as he realized what he had walked into. His eyes flicked between them, unsure where to land. The air thickened. Claire stepped forward, placing the groceries on the counter with more care than she felt. "Do you think I cook that badly?" she asked, her voice holding steady even as her throat tightened. It wasn't anger, it was something sharper, more fragile. Marilyn blinked once, then shrugged lightly. "I'm showing you how to get it right, that's all." Ethan stood frozen at the frame of the doorway, hands shoved into his pockets, like a man trying to disappear inside himself. Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her, the question ringing between them, with no buffer left to soften it. She didn't look at Ethan. She already knew he wouldn't step in. She backed away from the stove, resting her hand on the cold countertop as if anchoring herself. The stainless steel felt grounding, its chill offering something real to hold. She inhaled once, slowly, letting the air steady the tremor sitting just behind her ribs. "I need a minute," she said, her voice barely above a breath. She grabbed her phone, the screen reflecting her strained expression, and headed toward the balcony for air she wasn't sure she'd find. The silence she left behind felt jagged, stretching into the space she could no longer occupy without splintering. Outside, she called Lucy, who answered from the fluorescent aisles of a grocery store. The background hum of carts and chatter filled Claire's ear like a reminder of normal life, a life not lived under someone else's shadow in the kitchen. "What happened this time?" Lucy asked gently. Claire described the scene, the salt, the tone, the casual intrusion. Lucy didn't interrupt. When Claire finished, Lucy said, "That kitchen is supposed to be yours. You don't need to apologize for wanting space in your own home." Claire closed her eyes, letting the words settle like warm air against the cold evening breeze. She didn't cry. She just exhaled, long and quiet. Back inside, Claire returned to the kitchen, her steps soft but certain. The metal spoon Marilyn had used lay against the edge of the pot, still trembling slightly from where it had been placed. The faint ringing of metal against metal lingered in the air, thin and sharp. Claire stared at it for a moment, absorbing the sound as if it confirmed everything she had been trying not to believe. The room felt different now, clearer, starker. She loosened her scarf, set down her phone, and let the silence sit. Dinner that night tasted different before anyone even lifted a fork. Claire could sense it in the way Ethan sat stiffly, in the way Marilyn adjusted her napkin as if preparing for a critique rather than a meal. The first bite confirmed it. The dish was far too salty. Claire's throat tightened as she swallowed, forcing down both the food and the rising embarrassment. She glanced at Marilyn, who lifted her eyebrows in a sympathetic gesture that didn't feel sympathetic at all. "Maybe it's just youthful seasoning," she said lightly. The words landed with a soft thud, like something meant to be playful but sharpened at the edges. Claire kept her smile small, contained, even as her chest hollowed. She looked to Ethan, hoping for a soft laugh, a shake of his head, anything that might push the tension away. But he stayed quiet, pushing the food around his plate as though silence were the safest place to stand. That silence felt louder than Marilyn's comment, echoing through Claire in a way she hadn't expected. She lowered her gaze, her pulse steady but heavy, the room humming with conversations she didn't have the energy to start. Her fork scraped faintly against the plate, the metallic sound stretching out longer than it should have. The meal continued in awkward murmurs, none of which eased the weight in her chest. After they left Marilyn's house, Ethan suggested stopping for ice cream, a habit they'd formed to soften difficult evenings. The neon sign outside the small corner shop flickered, casting a bluish tint on their faces as they stepped inside. Claire chose her usual flavor but barely tasted it. The cold sat flat on her tongue. Ethan tried to meet her eyes, but his attempts felt thin, like a bandage pressed over something that needed more than covering. They sat on a bench outside, the streetlights humming above them. Claire let her spoon rest in the cup, watching the ice cream melt slowly along the edges. Neither of them spoke for a while. Silence again. Different this time, but still heavy. When Ethan finally took a breath to speak, Claire turned slightly, ready to listen, hoping for honesty. "I'll talk to her," he said. His voice was gentle, low. "Just, maybe not tonight." The words drifted between them, soft and uncertain. Claire nodded, though something in her chest dimmed. "Not tonight" often became "not soon." She didn't push. She simply watched the small puddle forming in her cup and told herself it wasn't worth starting an argument over. A breeze moved through the street, lifting a strand of her hair and brushing it across her cheek, like a reminder she was still here, waiting. When they got back to Marilyn's front steps to say goodbye, the porch light above the door flickered once, quick and faint. Claire glanced up, watching the bulb shudder in its casing. It was the smallest thing, but it made her pause. The air around them felt cooler suddenly, the night leaning in with a quiet message she couldn't yet interpret. Ethan squeezed her hand once before letting go. Marilyn waved from the doorway, her silhouette framed in warm light. Claire stood there for a moment longer as the porch light flickered again, softer this time, before studying. Claire woke earlier than usual the next morning, the apartment still wrapped in a soft blue haze. She moved around the kitchen with a steadiness she hadn't felt in days. Measuring, chopping, blending, her hands found a rhythm that belonged only to her. She was making a new sauce, one she had been thinking about for weeks. Gentle herbs, a bit of citrus, a warm undertone that reminded her of late afternoons with her grandmother. As it simmered, the scent filled the kitchen in slow layers. Claire tasted a small spoonful and closed her eyes. It was simple, balanced, hers. She placed the small glass bottle on the counter and whispered, almost amused, "You're going everywhere with me from now on." For the first time in a while, the air felt light enough to breathe fully. When she set the bottle down, it tapped softly against the wooden cutting board, creating a tiny vibration. Claire paused, watching the slight tremble. She brushed her thumb over the lid, grounding herself in its familiar weight. Lucy arrived minutes later, letting herself in with the casual ease of someone who'd been doing so for years. "What's that smell?" she asked, sniffing dramatically as she walked toward the stove. Claire poured her a taste. Lucy's eyes widened immediately. "Claire, this is amazing! You could sell this!" Claire laughed, not politely but genuinely, the sound bubbling up before she could stop it. It felt like a window opening. For a moment, she didn't feel small or overcorrected or observed. She felt capable. Ethan wandered into the kitchen in his work shirt, glancing between Claire and Lucy with sleepy curiosity. "What's going on?" he asked, reaching for coffee. Claire handed him a spoonful of the sauce. His eyebrows lifted. "It's good," he admitted. "Really good." But then he lowered his voice slightly, glancing toward the hallway. "Just, maybe don't tell my mom you made something new." The sentence hung in the air like a draft. Claire's smile dimmed, though she kept it gentle. She set the spoon down carefully. "Why not?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Ethan hesitated. "She'll have opinions." The pause between words felt longer than the space they occupied. Claire placed the bottle into her pale pink tote bag before heading out for work, letting the smooth glass slide into the pocket she always used for essentials. She didn't know why, but carrying it made her feel steadier, as if she'd tucked a piece of herself safely away. The morning light filtered through the blinds, catching the curve of the bottle inside the bag. She slung the tote over her shoulder, the faint clink inside a quiet reassurance. The hallway outside was cool and smelled faintly of detergent, a familiar comfort as she locked the door. She felt ready, maybe not for everything, but for something. It was enough. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone vibrated 3 times in quick succession. She glanced at the screen. Marilyn. "Are you two eating dinner tonight?" Another buzz. "I can swing by if needed." A final one. "Don't forget to defrost the chicken." Claire stared at the messages, a thin smile tugging at her mouth. Not amused, not irritated, something more complicated. The elevator doors closed slowly around her, sealing her in a quiet silver box. The soft hum of the descent wrapped her like a question she wasn't ready to answer. She slipped her hand into her bag, brushing the cool glass of the bottle, feeling it steady her as she exhaled. Claire arrived at Marilyn's house, carrying a container of pasta she'd prepared earlier, the steam still warm beneath the lid. Her steps were careful, deliberate, as though she were entering a room where every sound meant something. The kitchen smelled faintly of garlic and furniture polish, a mix she always associated with Marilyn. As Claire placed her tote on the counter, she felt her heartbeat thud lightly, an echo of anticipation more than fear. She reminded herself she had cooked well, that the sauce was hers, that she deserved to take up space here too. Still, her breath slowed as she set the dish down beside the cutting board, gathering herself before opening the lid. She turned just as Marilyn walked in, her gaze drifting briefly, pointedly, to the pink tote bag near the counter. "What's that you brought?" Marilyn asked, her voice mild but edged. Claire swallowed, keeping her tone even. "Just some seasoning I like," she said, sliding her body slightly in front of the bag. Marilyn didn't move closer, yet her presence filled the room with the kind of attention that made Claire hyper-aware of every small gesture she made. The air felt tighter. Claire brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and nodded toward the pasta. "I thought I'd cook tonight." The words felt steady enough, though her shoulders held a quiet tension. As Claire prepared the ingredients, Marilyn stepped behind her again, close enough that Claire caught the faint scent of her perfume. Not overwhelming, just insistent. Claire stirred the pasta slowly, hearing every small sound, the bubbling of water, the soft scrape of metal against ceramic, the subtle inhale behind her. She felt watched, not aggressively, just consistently, like Marilyn needed to track every movement to understand or correct it. Claire kept her back straight, her hands precise. "Smells fine," Marilyn murmured, as though offering a verdict rather than an observation. Claire didn't respond. She only stirred once more, then set the spoon aside gently. She plated the pasta with deliberate care, the sauce glistening under the kitchen lights. Her hands steadied as she worked, more from focus than confidence. Marilyn stepped back only a few inches, but it was enough for Claire to breathe a little easier. She reached for the herb she'd brought, sprinkling them softly over the dish. Marilyn's gaze followed each motion like an inspection. Claire didn't let it stop her. This was her meal, her effort. She placed the final plate on the table and wiped her palms on a towel, feeling the faint tremor begin to settle into calm. She could stand here. She could cook here. She repeated the thought quietly, almost like a mantra. When Marilyn finally sat, Claire hovered a moment, adjusting the napkins, steadying her breathing. She could feel the scrutiny even from across the room. She inhaled once, then filled a glass of water, letting the coolness run over her fingers. When she returned to the table, she caught Marilyn watching her. Not distrustful, not approving, simply curious in a way that made Claire's stomach tighten. She set the glass down gently in front of Marilyn and took her seat. The air shifted, subtle and faint, as if waiting for something to break or settle. Claire smoothed the corner of her napkin while her pulse ticked quietly beneath her skin. A cloud of steam rose from the pasta and drifted upward, catching the kitchen light. It shimmered faintly, making the bulbs flicker for a heartbeat before steadying again. Claire looked up, noticing the brief tremor in the glow, small but enough to feel. She wasn't sure why it made her pause. Maybe because it reminded her of the uncertainty she'd been carrying for weeks. Maybe because it felt like the room acknowledging something she couldn't yet name. She clasped her hands together under the table, feeling warmth return to her palms. For a moment, in that dim shimmer, she felt the beginning of something shift quietly inside her. Claire had barely stepped into the dining room when she heard the low rumble of voices from the living room. She stopped beside the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame. Ethan and Marilyn were facing each other, Ethan with his arms crossed, Marilyn with her chin lifted in quiet defiance. "You can't expect her to cook the way you want every time," Ethan said, his voice tight but controlled. Marilyn scoffed softly, turning her head as though dismissing an exaggeration. "I don't dislike her," she insisted. "But she doesn't understand our style. It's not a crime to try to help." Claire remained still, absorbing each word with the careful attention of someone watching a fragile object tilt. Marilyn's tone sharpened, though her volume stayed low. I don't like the way she does things." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and familiar. Claire's stomach tightened, the same way it had tightened around every subtle criticism, every small correction. Marilyn wasn't trying to be cruel. Claire could see that. But intention didn't erase impact. Ethan stepped closer, frustration showing in the slow exhale he tried to hide. "It's not about style, Mom. You're not giving her a chance." His voice wasn't raised, but the tension threaded through it made the room feel smaller. Claire lowered her eyes, not wanting to be the cause of another tug of war. Ethan's next words were quieter, but they carried more weight. "You're trying to control everything again." Marilyn's expression flickered, a brief crack of vulnerability underneath the composure she wore like a familiar necklace. "I'm not controlling," she replied, but her voice wavered, just once. Claire felt her chest constrict. She didn't want to stand between them. She didn't want their relationship strained because of her. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Claire shifted her weight and stared down at her hands, wishing she could fold herself into the walls to avoid being the center of a conflict she never wanted. She took one slow step back and stood near the thin screen door leading to the balcony. The mesh vibrated lightly under her fingertips as she clung to the frame. She didn't want to interrupt, but she couldn't endure being the invisible audience to another argument about her cooking, her presence, her efforts. The screen's metal felt cool under her palm, grounding her. She steadied her breathing, wishing she could step outside into the evening air, but knowing it would only draw more attention. The house felt dense, the air warm and unmoving, the kind of atmosphere where emotions sit heavy on every surface. As she stood there, Claire heard her name, spoken softly by Ethan, not accusingly, but with a gentle plea. She closed her eyes briefly, her heartbeat tapping against her ribs. She reached instinctively for her tote bag beside her, her fingers brushing the familiar shape tucked inside. For a moment, the simple contact steadied her enough to stand taller. She wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being the piece everyone kept rearranging without permission. She inhaled, long and slow, before letting her hand fall away from the bag. A sudden gust of wind hit the balcony outside, pushing against the screen door with a soft creak. The sound sliced through the silence between the three of them. All heads turned, Marilyn's brow lifting, Ethan's shoulders tightening, Claire's breath catching. The small, weathered door moved again, gently but insistently, as though nudged by something unseen. In the tense quiet of the room, the creaking sound felt strangely loud, like a reminder none of them had asked for. Claire looked down, her fingers still tingling faintly. Something unspoken shifted between them, quiet but unmistakable. Claire returned to the kitchen to finish the pasta, hoping the argument had settled into something manageable. But when she stepped inside, she saw Marilyn standing at the counter, with the confidence of someone preparing a demonstration. "Let me show you how to do it properly," Marilyn said, picking up the salt jar with the familiarity of a teacher holding chalk. Before Claire could respond, Marilyn tossed a heavy handful into the pot, so much that the grains hit the surface with a soft splash. Claire stopped in her tracks, her breath halting for a moment. It wasn't correction, it was statement. Each grain dissolved into the water like a quiet declaration she had no intention of softening. Ethan lingered near the doorway, one hand at the back of his neck, his gaze shifting between them. He opened his mouth, then closed it, stepping backward instead of forward. Claire watched the retreat, a small ache sliding beneath her ribs. She turned back to the pot, the broth now clouded with a salt she hadn't chosen. Marilyn folded her arms. "This is how it gets real depth," she said. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it cut with precision. Claire lifted the ladle, letting the liquid stream back into the pot, watching the ripples spread as though the water carried a message she wasn't ready to hear. "Cooking isn't just technique," Claire murmured, mostly to herself. "It's an intention." But the words felt swallowed by the kitchen walls, absorbed before they reached anyone else. She set the ladle down carefully, taking a slow breath through her nose. The air smelled aggressively seasoned now, heavy with something she couldn't blend out. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, grounding herself against a rising wave of frustration she didn't want to let slip. She wasn't raised to escalate. She wasn't raised to embarrass someone older. But she also wasn't raised to disappear. She felt all three truths pulling at her. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the heat on the stove. She wasn't going to argue about salt. Not today, not like this. She lifted the pot and carried it to the sink, letting the steam wash over her face. Her eyes stung, not from emotion, but from the sharpness of the seasoning hitting the air. She poured a small ladleful into a bowl, tasted it, and felt her tongue recoil. It wasn't her cooking anymore. It had become something else, something overwritten. She set the bowl down, pressing her palms flat on the counter. Marilyn watched her, unbothered, as if expecting Claire to accept the lesson and move on. Claire drew in a breath that didn't steady her as much as she hoped. She put the bowl aside, her movements slower, heavier. "This isn't cooking anymore," she whispered. "This is a message." She hadn't meant for Marilyn to hear it, but the room carried the words clearly. Marilyn blinked but didn't flinch. Ethan shifted again in the doorway, guilt sitting squarely in his posture. Claire felt her throat tighten, quietly, painfully, at the realization that she stood alone in this small storm. She stepped back from the counter, her heartbeat echoing faintly against her ribs like a warning drum. As she set the bowl aside, a single drop of briny broth fell from the ladle onto the stovetop, spreading into a thin, shining circle. She stared at it longer than she meant to, at the way it widened, absorbed, and vanished into the metal. Something about its quick surrender unsettled her. She wiped it gently with a towel, but her hand paused in midair, the motion slowing as though her body recognized a fracture before her mind did. In the still room, with steam curling upward and silence settling heavy, she knew something had shifted in a way that wouldn't go back to normal. Claire set the small glass bottle on the dining table with a slow, steady motion, as though placing something fragile in front of a judge. The late afternoon light slid across the surface, catching the curved edges of the bottle and casting a warm gold reflection on the table. Marilyn paused mid-step as she entered the room, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Claire didn't look away. She took her seat calmly, folding her hands in her lap, while the bottle stood between them like a quiet declaration. Ethan hovered behind her, uncertain, his breath caught halfway between support and apprehension. The room felt hushed, suspended in a small moment where everything mattered more than it appeared to. Marilyn approached the table with careful steps, each one gentler than Claire expected. Her gaze dipped to the bottle again. "You're planning to use that here?" she asked, her voice softer than the usual edge she carried. Claire nodded once, the movement slow but unwavering. "I'm using it for me," she said, not defensive, not apologetic. The sentence seemed to rearrange the air itself. Marilyn blinked, the faintest crack of surprise crossing her expression. She pressed her palms lightly on the back of a chair, the wood creaking under the small shift of her weight. Claire watched her carefully, not to challenge her, but to make sure she didn't shrink from the moment. The tension threaded through the room like a thin wire. Ethan stepped between them instinctively, though he didn't say anything at first. His eyes moved from Claire to his mother, then back again, as if searching for a safe place to land. Claire reached for the pasta bowl and brought it closer, her movements deliberate, grounding herself in the simple act of preparing a meal. Marilyn remained standing, her fingers tapping lightly against the chair's frame, a habit Claire recognized as an internal debate. The silence stretched, not hostile, not warm, just charged with a history of unspoken boundaries. Claire lifted the lid from the pot. Steam drifted up, warm and fragrant, curling around her shoulders like soft encouragement. She unscrewed the lid of the bottle slowly, the faint click breaking the tension like a pin dropping on velvet. She added a small spoonful of her sauce to the pasta, stirring gently, the colors merging into something vibrant and familiar. She didn't look up. She didn't need permission. Her heart thudded softly, but not in fear, more like recognition. This was hers. This moment. This choice. When she finally glanced up, she found Marilyn watching, not with anger, but with something closer to unsettled curiosity. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat beside Claire instead of across from her. His knee brushed hers beneath the table, a silent gesture of alignment. Claire didn't lean into him, but she felt the quiet solidarity wrap around her like an unseen arm. Marilyn shifted her stance, her shoulders lowering a fraction. Claire offered her a neutral look, not an invitation, not a challenge, just clarity. The air eased, though only by a notch. She scooped a portion of pasta onto her plate, letting the sauce settle around the noodles in soft swirls. Her breath fell evenly, each inhale steadier than the last. As she reached for her fork, the overhead light caught the metal lid of the bottle, creating a brief gleam that flashed once across the surface, bright, sharp, then gone. Claire didn't react, but she noticed it. Marilyn noticed it too. Something small and unspoken passed between them. Not reconciliation, not surrender, but recognition. A line had been drawn, not harshly, not with anger, but with gentle, undeniable certainty. Claire set her fork down for a moment and let the silence settle. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was borrowing space. Claire stepped out to take the trash, the plastic bag swinging lightly from her fingertips, the evening air settling cool around her. She stayed outside longer than necessary, letting the dim hallway lighting soothe the nerves that had frayed throughout dinner. By the time she returned, her breath had steadied, but as she walked back into the kitchen, she stopped. Marilyn stood at the stove again, her hand tilted over the pot with a small scoop of salt. Too much, too late, too familiar. The grains poured out in a smooth line, catching the glow from the overhead light. Claire froze mid-step, feeling the warmth drain from her face. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't habit. It was a pattern. Their eyes met, Marilyn steady, Claire stunned. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The kitchen hummed softly, the simmering pot filling the silence with tiny, restless bubbles. Claire felt something shift under her ribs. Not anger exactly, but the moment right before anger becomes form. "Why are you doing that?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that even the steam seemed to lean in. Marilyn didn't flinch. "Because it needs it," she answered, calm, as if stating the time or weather. Her certainty struck harder than any criticism she'd said before. It landed deep in the space Claire had been trying to protect. Claire stepped closer, the floor cool beneath her feet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even change her expression. "I didn't ask you to fix it." The words came out smooth, controlled. Marilyn blinked, the only sign she'd heard them. The spoon in her hand hovered above the pot, dripping a slow trail back into the broth. The air between them grew thick, pressing gently against both women. Claire kept her hands at her sides to avoid the impulse to shield the pot, to shield herself. She wouldn't give that gesture power. She wouldn't show how deeply the repeated intrusion had settled under her skin. Ethan walked in just then, stopping sharply as if stepping into a room mid-storm. The look on his face said he understood more than he had before. He watched the two women, his mouth parting slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but he didn't. He hesitated, then lowered his eyes. The choice not to choose became another small betrayal that hit Claire quietly, without dramatics. She didn't turn to him. She stayed focused on Marilyn, on the tension held in the older woman's shoulders. The pot hissed softly beneath them, releasing a faint cloud of salted steam that stung Claire's eyes. Claire reached to adjust the lid, and in the movement, her elbow brushed a metal container on the counter. The lid toppled off with a gentle clatter, spinning in a small circle on the floor before settling flat. The sound rang through the room, bright and thin, like the final note of a question none of them wanted to ask aloud. Marilyn looked down. Ethan exhaled. Claire didn't move to pick it up right away. She simply watched it rest there, still and reflective on the tiles, as if marking the exact point where patience thinned to its last thread. She straightened slowly, her breath deepening. The room seemed to quiet all at once. The simmering pot, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the muted clink of utensils, all dropping into a softer rhythm. Claire felt her heartbeat settle into something clearer, sharper. She wasn't trying to win anything anymore. She was simply done pretending she didn't notice what was happening. She held Marilyn's gaze for one long, steady moment. Then she turned off the stove without a word. Claire didn't wait for anyone to speak. She stepped away from the stove, wiping her palms on a dish towel that still held the warmth of the kitchen. The room felt too tight, too familiar in its tension. She slipped her shoes on quietly, grabbed her tote bag without pausing to check its contents, and headed for the door. The hallway felt like a breath of cold air rushing toward her, brushing away the heat of the argument she hadn't fully engaged in. She didn't slam the door. She didn't make a sound. Her exit was soft. So soft it startled even her. Her footsteps echoed lightly on the polished floor, each one steadier than the last. She walked toward the elevator with her shoulders set gently back, not in defiance but in self-preservation. Her pulse beat in a slow, controlled rhythm, as though her body was catching up to a decision her mind had already made. She pressed the button, the light blinking on with a muted glow. When the elevator doors parted, she stepped inside without a backward glance. The moment the doors began to close, she exhaled fully for the first time that evening. The silence inside the elevator settled around her like a warm blanket in a cold room, unexpected but needed. Inside her tote bag, the small glass bottle knocked softly against her hip as the elevator descended. The sound was faint, almost comforting. Claire rested her back against the cool metal wall, closing her eyes for a brief second. Her breath fogged slightly on the surface behind her. Everything felt quieter down here, less sharp, less personal. She clutched the strap of her bag gently, taking in the subtle scent of herbs still lingering from the sauce she'd made earlier. It grounded her in a way she hadn't anticipated. A reminder she wasn't losing herself, just reclaiming a small part she'd set aside too many times. Her head leaned back, and she felt the vibration of the elevator humming behind the metal. A single tear slid down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the release that comes when a truth finally sits without resistance. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it reach her jawline before brushing it off with the back of her hand. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I need to choose me." The words didn't echo. They simply existed in the air, fragile and steady at once. She inhaled deeply, the scent of steel and soft detergent filling her lungs. The elevator jolted slightly, not dramatically, just a gentle shiver running through the floor. Claire opened her eyes, her heartbeat rising for half a moment before easing. The lights overhead flickered once in a brief muted pulse. It wasn't threatening. It was just enough to break the stillness. She watched the panel numbers glow and change, feeling a strange sense of alignment with the downward motion. Each floor passed felt like another layer shedding, expectations, tension, the unspoken weight she'd carried for weeks. She allowed herself another long, intentional breath. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors slid open slowly, revealing the empty corridor ahead. Claire didn't step out right away. She stood there, letting the cool, open space greet her with a quiet invitation. It wasn't escape. It was pause. A moment to acknowledge how far she'd stretched herself, how much she'd swallowed for harmony. She straightened her posture, adjusting the strap of her bag, and stepped forward with the lightest thud of her shoes against the tile. Behind her, the elevator doors eased shut, the soft rumble marking the end of a chapter she'd been hesitating to close. Ethan found Claire sitting on the small sofa near the lobby's window, her tote bag resting by her feet. She didn't look upset, just emptied of noise, the way a room feels after a long argument. He approached slowly, hands in his pockets, his steps soft on the tiled floor. "Claire," he said gently. She lifted her eyes but didn't shift her posture. His face carried exhaustion, the kind that comes from realizing too late what should have been said earlier. He sat at a careful distance beside her, leaving space she didn't move to fill. Her heartbeat stayed calm, steady, almost too quiet for the moment. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice low. "I froze. I shouldn't have." Claire nodded once, the movement small but real. "I know you were stuck," she replied, "but standing outside of it still feels like standing away from me." Ethan let the words settle before responding.
"I wasn't trying to."
His voice sounded younger, thinner, and it softened her just enough to breathe easier. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on, casting pale reflections across the marble floor. Claire watched them dance, their glow stretching into the cracks between her thoughts. She reached into her tote and set the small glass bottle on the coffee table between them, not with drama, but with intention. The bottle caught the warm lobby light and held it in its curve. "I don't want to hide things that matter to me," she said softly. "Not from your mother, not from you." Ethan looked at the bottle, then at her, his shoulders lowering. "You shouldn't have to," he said. There was no hesitation this time. His hands rested loosely on his knees, fingers unclenched, as though he were finally choosing to be present rather than neutral. His voice wavered just slightly as he continued. "I didn't realize how alone you felt in that kitchen." Claire watched his expression, the regret etched gently around the corners of his mouth. "I didn't want to tell you," she admitted. I didn't want you to feel torn. Ethan shook his head. But I already was. I just pretended I wasn't. The honesty landed softly, like a blanket being laid down rather than a weight being added. Claire breathed out slowly, feeling something in her chest ease, not fully, but noticeably. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The lobby was quiet except for the distant hum of the elevator returning to another floor. Claire leaned back against the sofa, letting her shoulder brush the cushion instead of holding herself upright out of habit. Ethan watched her carefully, as though seeing her edges for the first time. I want to do better, he said finally. I want you to feel like you have a place in that house, and in this family. Claire looked at him, not with skepticism, but with contemplative calm. I want that too, she answered, her voice steady, but it can't happen if we pretend nothing's wrong. The hallway lights flickered briefly, once, long enough for both of them to notice. Ethan turned toward the source, but Claire simply exhaled, her shoulders softening. We're at a crossroads, she said quietly. Not a fight, just a direction. Ethan nodded. Her fingers grazed the glass bottle again, grounding herself in something simple and true. The air between them felt different now, not resolved but honest. And honesty, she realized, was the first step toward rebuilding anything worth keeping. Claire filled out the registration form at the community center with a pen that left smooth, dark lines. The room smelled faintly of chalk dust and citrus cleaner, a combination that reminded her of old classrooms and beginnings she never fully embraced. She tucked her hair behind her ear as she wrote her name, feeling a quiet spark of something she hadn't felt in a while. Ownership. Not over a kitchen, not over a dish, but over her path. When she handed the form to the receptionist, the woman smiled warmly, the kind of smile that didn't demand anything in return. First class starts tonight, she said. Claire nodded, letting the simple fact settle gently in her chest. The cooking room buzzed softly with conversation when Claire entered. Students shuffled around the stainless steel stations, tying aprons and unpacking their knives. She felt a flicker of nerves, but it wasn't the sharp, defensive kind she felt at Marilyn's house. This was lighter, almost hopeful. The instructor, a cheerful man with salt and pepper hair, greeted her with a nod and pointed her toward an empty station. Trust your tongue, he said as the class began. It knows you better than the recipe does. Claire absorbed the words quietly, letting them anchor her more than she expected. When he tasted her first dish, he smiled with genuine pleasure. You've got a refined palate, he said. Heat rose to her cheeks, but this time the warmth felt good. After class, Claire wandered through the small outdoor market across the street. She stopped at a plant stand where a tiny basil pot sat, leaves glossy under the evening light. Something about its simplicity tugged at her. She bought it without hesitation, cradling it carefully against her chest as she walked home. The basil smelled fresh and green, a scent that filled her lungs with quiet resolve. She imagined it sitting on her counter, her kitchen counter, bringing life to the space that too often felt invaded. The thought comforted her. When she reached home, Ethan noticed the plant immediately. That's new, he said, smiling as he leaned against the doorway. His tone wasn't teasing or uncertain. It was gentle, appreciative. Claire placed the basil on the counter, adjusting it until it looked settled. It felt right, she said softly. Ethan stepped closer, watching her hands as she arranged the leaves. It fits, he replied. Feels like it belongs here. Claire paused, hearing something deeper hidden behind the simple statement. Belonging wasn't about kitchens or seasoning or salt. It was about having room to breathe without fearing correction. She prepared a small dish that night, wanting to test what she'd learned. The aroma of toasted garlic and warm herbs drifted through the apartment, weaving into the quiet in a way that felt healing. Claire stirred with steady hands, tasting thoughtfully. The basil brightened the flavor with a gentle, aromatic lift. She plated it with a calm she didn't have weeks ago. The kitchen light glowed softly over the dish, and she felt a warmth settle into her bones. Not triumph, not rebellion, but alignment. Cooking hadn't left her. She had simply been too crowded to hear it. As she slid the plate across the counter, the toaster clicked on unexpectedly, releasing a warm hint of baked bread into the room. She didn't question it. She simply breathed in the scent and let the moment be what it was. Quiet, grounded, hers. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with soft eyes, and allowed herself the smallest real smile. For the first time in a long time, the kitchen felt like a place she could return to without bracing herself. Marilyn called in the early afternoon, her voice softer than Claire expected. "I'll stop by later," she said, as though asking permission without quite asking. Claire held the phone to her ear, listening to the tentative cadence beneath the words. "Okay," she answered calmly. When the call ended, she stood in the middle of her kitchen, letting the quiet expand around her. She wasn't nervous, not the way she used to be. There was a steadiness in her that felt newly stitched, fragile but real. She set her hands on the counter and inhaled slowly, letting the scent of basil drift upward from the pot she'd placed near the window earlier that morning. She began preparing dinner, choosing a simple recipe, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress or defend. Just food she liked, flavors she trusted. The chopping, the simmering, the soft sizzle of garlic in the pan brought a calm rhythm to the air. She adjusted the table, smoothing the fabric of the runner, and lighting a small candle that flickered warmly beside the dish she planned to serve. She didn't worry how Marilyn would interpret it. She wasn't staging anything. She was making a space she wanted to sit in herself. The kitchen felt gentle for once, like the world wasn't waiting to critique her next move. When she opened a cabinet to retrieve a serving bowl, the sound of the door closing sent a faint vibration through the shelf. The lid of the small glass bottle gave a tiny rattle, a soft tremor of metal against glass. Claire paused, glancing at it. Not startled, just aware. She touched the top lightly, steadying it with a fingertip. Somehow, the tremble felt like a reminder of how easily balance can shift, but also how possible it is to find it again. She let her hand drift away, returning to her stove with a composed breath. The evening light painted the edges of the kitchen in muted gold, settling the room into a thoughtful quiet. Marilyn arrived right on time, standing at the doorway with her purse tucked neatly under her arm. There was something tentative in her expression, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Dinner smells nice," she said, her voice low. Claire nodded with a small smile. She didn't step aside nervously or rush to compensate. She simply guided Marilyn to the table with gentle ease. Marilyn's hands were clasped together, the subtle twist of her fingers betraying nerves she rarely exposed. Claire noticed but didn't name it. She set a plate down in front of her mother-in-law with a calm steady enough to make the air itself feel less brittle. For a moment, neither woman moved. The candle flickered softly, sending a warm glow across Marilyn's face. She picked up her fork but didn't take a bite yet. Claire stood across from her, waiting, not for approval, not for critique, but for a presence that felt mutual instead of one-sided. Marilyn finally lifted a small bite to her lips, tasting slowly. Her expression didn't show delight, didn't show disapproval, just a quiet processing. Claire held her breath only briefly before letting it go. She wasn't reaching for validation anymore. She only wanted honesty that wasn't edged with control. As they sat together, the ceiling fan began its steady rotation above them, its blades creating a soft, rhythmic whir that filled the pauses in conversation. The sound was gentle, almost soothing, smoothing the edges of their shared silence. Claire watched the shadows shift across the walls, feeling the smallest sense of peace settle in her chest. The moment wasn't transformative, not dramatic, but it was real. And real, she realized, was more than enough. Marilyn lifted another forkful, tasting slowly as though trying to decode something she hadn't expected to find on her tongue. Claire watched discreetly, not with tension, but with an even, grounded steadiness. For the first time, Marilyn didn't offer an immediate critique. She simply nodded, one short, almost hesitant gesture. Claire felt the acknowledgement ripple through her, not triumphantly, but calmly, like a soft tide brushing her ankles. She sat down across from Marilyn, her hands folding lightly in her lap. "I cooked for my own taste today," Claire said, her tone gentle and unforced. She didn't raise her chin or brace herself. She simply stated it as truth. Marilyn's eyes flicked around the kitchen, lingering on the basil plant on the counter, the candle burning low, the carefully arranged table. Her expression shifted, subtly but clearly, as if she were seeing the room differently, realizing she wasn't the axis it revolved around anymore. She set her fork down with a measured breath. "It's different," she said. Not dismissive, not sharp, just unsure. Claire nodded lightly. "Yes, it is." The space between them didn't tighten the way it used to. It settled almost gently, like two people adjusting to a new temperature in the room. Ethan entered with a small grin, glancing between the two women as if checking the emotional weather. His eyes softened when he saw Claire sitting with such composed ease. He moved to take the seat next to her, the choice so natural it didn't need commentary. Marilyn watched him sit, her lips parting for a brief second, as if realizing how much that simple gesture revealed. Ethan leaned slightly toward Claire, not conspicuously, just close enough to make his alignment unmistakable. He looked at her plate, then at hers. "Smells amazing," he said, voice warm with quiet sincerity. Claire felt her shoulders loosen almost imperceptibly. They ate together with a calm that surprised all three of them. Claire spoke about her cooking class, briefly, without embellishment. Marilyn listened, her brow furrowed not in disapproval, but in contemplation. "A class?" she repeated softly. "Yes," Claire replied. "I wanted to learn more, and to enjoy it again." There was no accusation in her tone, no hint of defiance, just clarity. Marilyn looked down at her plate, turning her fork in her fingers. Something like bewilderment flickered through her expression. Not anger, not wounded pride, just the quiet recognition of losing a kind of unspoken control she'd always taken for granted. After dinner, Marilyn helped gather the dishes, her movement slower than usual. She didn't rearrange anything. She didn't reach over Claire's shoulder to adjust the stove, didn't offer to fix the seasoning. She simply stood beside Claire at the sink, passing her a plate with a small, almost tentative nod. Claire accepted it without fanfare, their hands brushing briefly, a touch neither of them flinched from. The moment felt small, but not insignificant. For once, the kitchen didn't feel like contested ground. It felt like neutral territory. As they finished cleaning, the steady chop of Ethan slicing fruit at the counter echoed through the room, precise, sure, rhythmic. Claire looked over, watching the blade rise and fall in a consistent pattern, each cut clean and even. The sound was almost soothing, grounding the room in something tangible and steady. Marilyn glanced toward the sound too, her face softening just slightly. Claire stood still for a moment, letting the gentle, repetitive sound anchor her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was bracing for something unseen. She let herself breathe. Marilyn reached for the spice rack almost without thinking, the old reflex guiding her hand toward a jar she had used 1,000 times. Claire stood at the stove, stirring a pot with slow, deliberate motions, the scent of simmering tomatoes and warm herbs drifting through the kitchen. Without turning, she sensed Marilyn stepping closer, too close, the way she always had. Marilyn's fingers were just inches from the rack when Claire gently shifted sideways and placed her palm over Marilyn's hand. Not forceful, not dramatic, just enough to be unmistakable. "I've got it," Claire said softly, her voice steady in a way it had never been before. Marilyn froze, her hands suspended between intention and withdrawal. For a moment, she looked genuinely startled, as though someone had flipped a mirror and shown her a version of herself she wasn't prepared to see. The room seemed to shrink and widen all at once. Ethan, carrying a bowl of greens toward the table, stopped mid-step. His eyes widened, not in alarm but in recognition. Claire lifted the wooden spoon again with calm precision, letting the rhythm of her cooking speak for her. Marilyn slowly lowered her hand, her fingers curling toward her palm, unsure what to do with a gesture she wasn't used to receiving. The air in the kitchen changed as if a window had been cracked open somewhere unseen. Marilyn stepped back, not defensively but thoughtfully, her posture less rigid, her shoulders easing a fraction. "I was only trying to help," she murmured. The words were softer than she intended, almost fragile. Claire nodded without looking away from the pot. "I know," she answered gently, "but I can handle this." She spoke it like a truth she'd finally allowed herself to claim. Ethan watched Claire with quiet pride, his expression holding something deeper than approval, relief, maybe, or admiration for courage he hadn't realized she'd been storing quietly inside her. Claire stirred the pot slowly, letting the sauce thicken to a deep, inviting red. Each motion felt anchored, confident. Marilyn watched, the lines on her face settling in new ways. She wasn't being pushed out. She was being asked to step aside, and the difference between the two landed somewhere deep beneath her ribs. The kitchen felt warmer, not from the stove, but from the absence of something sharp that had hovered between them for months. Claire sprinkled a pinch of fresh basil into the pot, letting the green leaves wilt softly into the mixture. Her hand didn't tremble. It hadn't trembled all evening. When Marilyn finally sat at the table, she looked smaller somehow. Not diminished, but quieter, as though navigating the unfamiliar terrain of letting someone else lead. Ethan set the bowl of greens down beside her, offering a reassuring smile before taking his seat next to Claire. Marilyn turned the silverware on her napkin, aligning it out of habit, then stopped halfway through the motion. She placed her hands together instead, a small concession to the shift in the room. Claire ladled the pasta into bowls, her movements fluid and unhurried. The kitchen rang with a peaceful kind of silence. As Marilyn reached for her spoon, it slipped from her fingers just slightly and tapped against the rim of the bowl, making a thin, clear sound. The vibration traveled through the ceramic, soft but noticeable, a delicate echo of the moment Claire had stopped her hand. Marilyn steadied the spoon, drawing in a breath she didn't fully realize she was holding. Claire met her eyes briefly across the table. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a victory. It was an understanding, quiet, mutual, and finally clear. Marilyn settled into her chair with a slow, almost restless motion, as though she were testing the air in a room that no longer moved around her command. Claire brought the bowl of pasta to the table, the fragrance rising softly. Tomatoes, basil, warmth. She placed it between them, her hands steady, her shoulders relaxed. Marilyn glanced at the dish with a cautious curiosity, her eyes tracking Claire's movements the way someone studies a language they've never learned to speak aloud. Claire slid into her seat, her posture open and unguarded. The chair felt different beneath her, like it finally belonged to her, not borrowed from someone else's comfort. Ethan watched the two women with quiet attentiveness, sensing something in the atmosphere he didn't want to interrupt. He poured water into the glasses, the stream catching the light and scattering faint reflections across the table. Claire lifted her fork first, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. She took a bite, savoring it slowly. Marilyn hesitated, then followed. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but the subtle softening at the corners of her mouth didn't go unnoticed. Claire caught it, held it gently in her awareness, and let it pass without gripping onto it too tightly. "It's good," Marilyn said finally, barely above a murmur, as though admitting it might change something irreversible. Claire met her eyes, offering a small, grounded nod. Thank you. No embellishment, no reaching. The simplicity of the exchange seemed to settle into the room like warm light. Marilyn took another bite, slower this time, as though discovering a flavor she didn't expect to respect. Behind them, Ethan leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders unspooling one measured inch at a time. Claire saw his chest rise and fall in a calmer rhythm. After dinner, Claire collected plates at a comfortable pace, her steps unhurried. Marilyn stood as if to help, her hands twitching toward the dishes, but she stopped. The pause wasn't stiff, it was thoughtful. She let her arms fall gently to her sides. That one small decision, of not intervening, not stepping in, felt like a shift in gravity. Claire washed the plates at the sink, the warm water running over her hands. Marilyn hovered near the table, watching but not supervising. Ethan dried the dishes beside Claire, passing them with a quiet efficiency that made the kitchen feel like shared ground instead of contested space. Marilyn sat again, folding her hands loosely on the table. She seemed smaller tonight, not diminished but humbled in a way Claire hadn't seen before. Her gaze drifted to the counter where the glass bottle rested among the other condiments, catching a thin ribbon of kitchen light. It glowed faintly, the reflection soft and unobtrusive. Marilyn looked at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Maybe she recognized its importance. Maybe she understood nothing yet. Claire didn't try to interpret it. She simply rinsed the last plate and set it aside to dry. As the evening wound down, the overhead kitchen light cast a warm line across the table's wooden grain. Marilyn traced that line with her eyes, her features gentler than they'd been in months. Claire wiped her hands on a towel and turned toward her slowly. The air felt balanced, as though a long-held breath had been released by all three of them. Marilyn finally spoke, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "You did well today." The words weren't dramatic, weren't grand, but they landed quietly in a space Claire no longer needed filled. Marilyn lingered at the table long after the plates had been cleared, her fingers lightly brushing the rim of her water glass. Claire dried her hands on a soft towel, feeling the weight of an unasked question pressing gently into the space between them. She leaned a hip against the counter, letting the quiet settle. Marilyn finally exhaled, a slow release that sounded closer to confession than conversation. "Do you think," she began, her voice thin, "that I've tried to make things hard for you?" Claire blinked, surprised not by the content, but by the vulnerability in the tone. She stepped closer without rushing. "I think," Claire said carefully, "you've tried to keep control, even when I didn't need you to." Marilyn's eyes dropped to the tablecloth, her fingertips tracing a faint wrinkle in the fabric. "I've done that my whole life," she murmured, not defensive, just honest. "When Ethan was little, when the house was loud, when I didn't know what else to hold on to." Claire listened, not filling the silence, letting each word land where it needed. The room felt warmer, fuller, not with tension, but with the unfamiliar weight of truth, finally spoken out loud. Marilyn swallowed hard. "I didn't realize it felt like I was pushing you out." Her voice softened even more. Claire nodded. "Sometimes it did. Sometimes it hurt. But I don't think you meant to." Ethan sat quietly nearby, as if afraid that even a breath too loud might break the moment. He watched the two women with an attentiveness he hadn't shown earlier in their marriage. A careful, humbled kind of presence. Claire caught his glance for a moment, and he mouthed a small "thank you," which tightened her chest in a gentle way, rather than a painful one. She took a seat across from Marilyn, folding her hands calmly. The candle had burned down to a stub, casting a softer glow across their faces. The night outside the window hummed with faint traffic, reminding Claire that the world continued, even when conversations like this felt like the center of everything. Marilyn finally looked up, her eyes damp but clear. I wasn't trying to scare you off, she said. I just didn't know how to make room for someone else. Claire let the truth of that settle between them. She didn't rush to soothe, didn't minimize. I can understand that, she said gently. But I need room. Not because I want distance from you, but because I want to stand on my own feet. Marilyn nodded slowly, her throat tightening as she swallowed. For once, she didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't justify. She simply absorbed the boundary being drawn with a quiet kind of acceptance. Ethan shifted in his seat, exhaling a breath that had lived inside him for months. The sound was soft but unmistakable, a letting go of something he had held tightly long before Claire ever entered the picture. Claire reached for the pitcher and poured Marilyn more water, her hand steady, her gesture simple. Marilyn accepted the glass with both hands, as though receiving something more significant than hydration. The kitchen felt still in a peaceful way now, the overhead light casting warm shadows along the cabinets. Marilyn ran her thumb along the glass and asked, almost tentatively, "So, where do we go from here?" Claire smiled faintly, the expression soft and unforced. "Forward," she said simply, but gently. Marilyn nodded, absorbing the word carefully. At that same moment, the pot on the stovetop released a small sigh of steam as the simmering water settled from earlier, the sound soft and delicate. Claire turned her head toward it, then back to Marilyn. She didn't need grand gestures or apologies wrapped in ceremony. This, the honesty, the calm, the willingness to shift, was enough. The night pressed softly against the windows, and Claire felt the beginning of something steadier forming between them. Not perfect, but possible. 2 days later, Ethan suggested they revisit something they'd tried months ago, but abandoned when tension filled every corner of their lives. "What if we make a cooking schedule?" he asked gently, standing near the counter where Claire was rinsing greens. "Not rigid, just balanced. We share the week. Mom joins when she wants. No one stepping over anyone." Claire paused, letting the water run cool over her hands. The idea didn't feel like compromise. It felt like room. "I'd like that," she said quietly. When she looked at him, she saw a steadiness in his expression she hadn't seen before. He wasn't trying to soothe conflict. He was trying to prevent it. They discussed it at Marilyn's house that evening, standing in her softly lit living room that smelled faintly of linen spray. Marilyn listened without interrupting, her fingers clasped together tightly, but her posture open. When Ethan finished explaining the rotation, Marilyn took a breath that trembled only slightly. "If it makes things easier," she said, "I'm willing to try." Her tone wasn't curt or reluctant, just tentative, like someone learning to move in a room with new furniture. Claire nodded gratefully, offering a calm smile. A small part of her loosened, as though the knot she had carried for months finally began to loosen thread by thread. Leaving Marilyn's house felt different this time. The porch light glowed steadily above them, not flickering, not wavering, casting a warm, even halo across the steps. The three of them said goodnight without tension or overlapping voices. Marilyn closed the door gently, not with the forceful finality of earlier evenings. Claire walked to the car beside Ethan, the cool night air brushing lightly along her arms. For the first time in a long stretch of weeks, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was soft. Ethan reached for her hand, and their fingers intertwined naturally, without hesitation. She felt her breath deepen, slow and sure. As they walked home, the street lamps cast long shadows across the sidewalk, each one swaying slightly in the evening breeze. The rhythm of their footsteps matched in an easy cadence. "Thank you," Ethan murmured, squeezing her hand once. Claire glanced up at him, her expression gentle. "For what?" she asked. He shrugged lightly. "For not giving up on the three of us." The sincerity in his voice brushed something tender inside her, something still healing but no longer raw. She leaned her head slightly toward him, letting the quiet intimacy fill the space between them. Back in their apartment, Claire set her bag on the counter and reached for 2 small bowls to make a late-night snack. Nothing fancy, just fruit and light crackers. The kitchen felt peaceful, no longer braced for interference. Ethan joined her, placing the cutting board beside her without being asked. Their movements were unhurried, companionable. It felt like partnership rather than negotiation. Claire sliced a pear into thin, even pieces, the blade gliding smoothly under her hand. She arranged the slices neatly on a plate, each one catching a soft gleam from the overhead light. When she carried the plate to the table, the warm glow from the window lamp spilled across the wooden surface, tinting everything in gold. The evening felt unassuming, but full. Ethan sat down beside her instead of across from her, his knee brushing hers. Claire took a bite of the pear, savoring the gentle sweetness. Nothing dramatic needed to happen. Nothing heavy needed to be spoken. It was enough that the air felt light, the night felt kind, and the path forward no longer felt like a tightrope, but a quiet walk they could share. The final dinner of their trial schedule arrived quietly, without the build-up or tension that had once felt inevitable. Claire prepped the kitchen with a calm that came from familiarity rather than defense. When Marilyn arrived, she carried a bowl of salad, simple greens with a light drizzle already resting on the leaves. She handed it to Claire without ceremony, her fingers brushing Claire's briefly. "For the table," she said. There was no explanation, no justification, just contribution. Claire accepted it with a small, sincere nod and placed it at the center of the table, letting the gesture sit between them like a peaceful truce. They moved around the kitchen with a rhythm that surprised even Ethan. Marilyn stayed near the table instead of drifting into Claire's workspace, her hands folded lightly as she observed, not critically, but curiously. Her gaze followed Claire's movements, yet without the old instinct to correct. Ethan watched them both with a quiet smile, relief threading softly through his posture. Claire set out plates with a gentle ease, the clink of ceramic against wood settling into the room like a familiar lullaby. The evening light cast long, warm shadows across the counter, making everything feel softer, closer. When they finally sat, Marilyn reached for her salad first. Claire invited her to serve herself, her tone natural rather than cautious. Marilyn tasted the greens, paused, then offered a small nod of approval, subtle but genuine. The conversation unfolded slowly, unforced. They talked about the neighbor who planted new flowers in the courtyard, about Ethan's coworker's new puppy, about a recipe Marilyn had been meaning to try but hadn't yet attempted. Nothing heavy, nothing delicate, just small, human things that made the room feel a little more like shared ground than opposing sides. Claire found herself relaxing into the evening, leaning back in her chair as she listened to Ethan recount a brief story from work. She sipped her water, letting the coolness ground her. Marilyn's posture softened too, her hands no longer tightly clasped, her shoulders less defensive. She looked around the apartment with a thoughtful expression, her eyes lingering on the basil plant near the window. "It's grown," she remarked softly. Claire glanced over and smiled. "It has." The exchange felt like a small bridge, simple, but crossing a distance they'd kept for far too long. Ethan stood to clear a few dishes, and Marilyn instinctively rose to help, then paused. "I'll just bring the salad bowl," she said, choosing a middle path between habit and restraint. Claire accepted it with quiet gratitude. The soft rattle of utensils, the sound of water running, and the hum of the evening breeze through the slightly cracked window all blended into a gentle background that held the night together. No one rushed, no one filled silence out of discomfort. They simply moved with each other in a way that felt balanced. When they walked Marilyn to the door, she gave a small smile, one touched with humility rather than pride. "Thank you for dinner," she said. Her voice held a warmth that hadn't been there before, a sincerity that settled gently into the hallway air. As she stepped out, a faint gust slipped through the doorway, brushing the edges of the room with cool air before the door eased shut again. Claire and Ethan stood together for a moment, listening to the quiet settling back into place. Peace wasn't perfect, but it was present, and that was more than enough for tonight. The weekend arrived with a gentle, steady warmth, the kind that makes windows glow softly in the morning. Claire stepped into the kitchen early, her bare feet brushing the cool tile, the basil plant still damp from the water she'd given it before bed. She moved around the space effortlessly, her gesture slow but confident, cracking eggs, warming bread, slicing fruit with a deliberate rhythm that filled the room with quiet purpose. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, hair slightly tousled, he leaned against the frame and watched her with a small, content smile. "You look at peace," he said softly. Claire paused, feeling the truth of it settle inside her. "I think I finally am." They ate breakfast near the open window, the breeze brushing their faces with a mild, early-day coolness. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand, holding it loosely. "Mom called last night," he said. Claire lifted her eyes. "She asked if she could bring a dish next time, something she makes from scratch." Claire let the words wash over her slowly. It wasn't an intrusion this time, just a contribution, a small offering toward harmony. "I'd like that," Claire replied, and she meant it. Not because she needed Marilyn's approval, but because she no longer felt threatened by her presence. The difference was subtle but life-changing. Later that afternoon, Claire cleaned the kitchen with unhurried motions, wiping the counter in long, even strokes. She placed the glass bottle back on the shelf where it had always belonged, no longer a symbol of defiance, just a quiet part of her space. She straightened the basil leaves gently, the scent rising fresh and green. Memory drifted in, of tension, raised voices, heavy silences, but it no longer clung to her. Instead, it felt like a chapter carefully closed, one she could look back on without bracing. She breathed deeply, the air light and clear in her chest. That evening, they visited Marilyn's house for a short meal. The porch light greeted them with a steady glow, no flicker, no dull shudder. Marilyn opened the door with an ease that surprised Claire. "Come in," she said, stepping back without hovering. The table was already set, a modest spread waiting. When Marilyn placed a small dish in front of Claire, she didn't explain it, didn't announce it, just smiled lightly. "I made something new," she said. Claire tasted it, the flavor warm and slightly sweet. "It's good," she said, with gentle sincerity. Marilyn nodded, pleased in a quiet, unguarded way. The moment rested softly between them. After dinner, as they prepared to leave, Marilyn walked them to the door. She hesitated, then reached out, not to correct Claire's collar or touch her elbow, but simply to rest a hand on her arm briefly. "Thank you for giving this family a chance to grow," she said. There was no tremor of pride in her voice, only humility. Claire held her gaze and felt something settle firmly between them. Not friendship yet, not closeness, but a mutual respect that didn't need to be spoken more than once. Ethan watched silently, his expression warm, almost relieved. The night air outside felt clean as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Claire slipped her hand into Ethan's, their fingers interlacing with natural ease. Behind them, the porch light glowed steadily, its warm cast stretching across the steps like a quiet blessing. Claire looked back once, not out of worry, not out of longing, but simply to acknowledge the distance they'd traveled. Then she turned forward. The path ahead wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, steady, warm, and honest. And for the first time, Claire walked into it without carrying anyone's shadow but her own. In the end, nothing changed with fireworks. No grand speeches, no dramatic reversals. Instead, peace arrived the way the morning light does. Quiet, steady, touching the edges of everything before you even realize it's there. Marilyn learned to loosen her grip. Ethan learned to stand beside me, not between us. And I learned that reclaiming myself didn't require being louder, only being clearer. Now, when I walk into our kitchen, I don't brace. I don't shrink. I don't wait for someone else's approval before picking up a spoon. The basil on the counter grows a little taller every week, its leaves reaching toward the window. And sometimes, when Marilyn visits, she stands beside it with a soft smile, as if understanding, finally, that growth doesn't threaten anyone. It simply fills the space it deserves. Life didn't become perfect. It became balanced. And that was enough. If this story touched you, or reminded you of something in your own life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share what moment resonated with you most. And if you want more stories like this, filled with quiet strength and emotional truth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.